Good. Great. Thank you, Maya. Welcome, everyone. So glad you all could come and join us tonight. Thank you for being here. It's wonderful to see you all. My name is Christine Francoeur, and I'm your Wellness Through Mindfulness host for Dr. Allan Donsky's talk tonight on befriending grief. I'm a member of the WTM committee as well as one of the teachers on the team. So I personally want to say, if you've been with us before, welcome back and thank you for joining us. And if you're new, welcome. Glad that you decided to join us for tonight's talk. We're a local Calgary group who shares several topics bi-monthly, the first and third Thursday of every month, on teachings related to mindfulness and other topics. We've been sharing these events through the Calgary Public Library for the past almost 2 years now, which has been a wonderful venue for us as we haven't been able to gather live. So big thanks to the Calgary Public Library team for all their support these past 2 years. If you're interested in a summary of tonight's talk, like Maya mentioned, you'll be able to find that on our website next week. And while you're there, you can also check out several other talks and upcoming events. So you'll find the information for the next talk, which will be on Thursday, May 19th with Manira Jiwa. Manira is a local expert on spring forest Qigong, and she will be exploring transforming emotional and physical pain with Qigong. And on June 2nd, you can join Dr. Linda Carlson on life-threatening illness as a catalyst to live your best life. So currently you can find those on our website to register the Wellness Through Mindfulness, or you can also visit the Calgary Public Library, search mindfulness, and you will find both of those events hosted there. And finally, I also want to let you know we have a really special half-day event on Saturday, June 4th from 9 to noon. So if you've been feeling called to deepen your practice by spending an extended period of time in practice, please come join us. The theme for this half-day event will be burning bright versus burning out. And this event was intended to create space to bring an antidote for fear, fatigue, exhaustion, or frustration. And the teaching team will be hosted by Dr. Phil Bluestein, Dr. Leslie Elstad, Dr. Allan Donsky, who you may know or will be meeting tonight for the first time, and myself. Registration for this event is actually only done on our website, and all the participation fees for that event will continue to help us support our communication efforts by keeping our website up and emailing our content out regularly to the community to make them aware of these events. But tonight we welcome Dr. Allan. He'll be here to share with us on befriending grief and returning to wholeness. And to know Allan is to know he is someone who tries to live in and from his heart. He has been a physician for 38 years and a child and adolescent psychiatrist for 25 of those. He is a clinical associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at U of C, and he's given many talks and workshops in schools and educational settings, the business world, universities, and psychiatry conferences. Easy for me to say. Allan incorporates mindfulness in his daily life and clinical work. He has a curiosity and deep abiding in what it means most deeply to be human. He draws his practice from multiple perspectives, including psychological, developmental, trauma awareness, and multiple spiritual traditions. He drinks from many wells as long as the water is pure. And tonight, if you've heard Dr. Donsky present before, you know you're in for a great evening of wisdom and fresh perspectives. So please join me in welcoming Allan.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Christine. It's a pleasure to be here. This evening's presentation, which is more of a sharing than presenting, is really on perhaps the hardest topic that any of us have to experience, which is related to grief. And grief being very, very personal, it relates to very intimate losses. And the pain of grief is perhaps the deepest, and in that sense, also very, very challenging. With that in mind, we're going to start with a mindful practice, and I just have a couple of opening comments. I'm going to ask people to sort of just drop in, as I call it. I'll lead a mindful practice, and you are free, of course, to at any point to not go along with where I might be leading. And if at any time you don't feel comfortable, or you feel overwhelmed, or you are feeling you just can't carry on, please, by all means, come out. If your eyes are being closed, you can feel free to open your eyes and do what you need to, because ultimately, befriending grief is befriending yourself. And so please don't feel you have to force yourself, or that you failed in any way if you're not able to do this. I also invite people to not perhaps take the greatest grief, which may be something in the past. It may be long ago. It may be something more recent, or it may be something that's coming up in the near future. So don't, try climb Everest if you haven't walked a couple of little hills first. So picking something that represents a personal loss and just coming along for the ride with me as we lead each other walking in a bit of a mindful sit. So with that preface, just to, if you're comfortable, you can allow your eyes to close. And befriending something, whether it's grief or otherwise, means actually coming into the presence of it. And a good place to start is just by recognizing you're in this moment mindfully. The only moment you're ever fully alive is this one. And very gently allowing yourself to just be present with whatever is in this moment. You're not trying to get anywhere. You're not trying to achieve anything. You're not trying to reach any special state of being, but just allowing with permission what is showing up for you in this moment. And just perhaps at the beginning, we'll anchor ourselves in the breath. And just noticing if there's any weight or heaviness, thinking about grief, or grief is showing up in any way. And just coming back to the breath at any point, or coming out completely. Just allowing the breath to breathe you, which is what it always does 24/7. Noticing if there's any tension anywhere, and with every breath out, you notice a little ease. And being very friendly towards yourself as we drop into this inner space. Because grief is not a thing. It's more of a process. And as we engage with anything in our lives, we have to be friendly and curious and pace ourselves. And resting in that inner space that goes by many names. You can call it the ground of your being. You can call it your heart, your soul, your essence. There's a certain energy and spirit there. And we all have this inner world. It's a very interesting place. And very gently in this space, very gently just opening yourself with the gentlest of permission to whatever grief you feel you can work with right now, whatever piece of grief. And bearing in mind, this isn't a group therapy session, and bearing in mind that this isn't the place for trauma work. This is just a little something that represents whatever grief is to you. And we haven't even defined it because we don't need to. We all know what grief is. We've all lived it and felt it and smelt it. So again, just very gently, what piece of grief is showing up for you right now? Perhaps it's a feeling. Perhaps it's a name. Perhaps it's a memory. Perhaps you can see this. You don't need to get close to it if you're not comfortable. You can keep it at a distance. It's a bit like approaching the coals of a fire. You want to be close enough that you can get a little warmth, but you don't want to get too close that you're going to feel burnt and scorched. You're in charge. And so whatever way, whatever form or color or shape or sense this grief has right now, and whatever or whoever it's in relation to, there's a very simple question to ask. And that is as follows. What does grief want with me? What is grief asking for? And there are as many answers as there can possibly be in a universe of griefs. Remembering that grief is just, in its essence, a feeling, an experience. And just like any feeling, it's asking something of me. Hunger asks me to eat, thirst asks me to drink. What is grief asking for? What does grief itself need? What's my relationship to grief? And what can we do together because it's here? So we sit and investigate this question. What am I being called to do? What would be productive? What would be nourishing? What kind of direction? And of course, we can't speed this up because Grief is a process. Nonetheless, the question's still valid. What am I being called for? And because we recognize grief as part of who we are and what we've been through and what we will go through, there's a mindful invitation to be skillful with it, to not make it worse. And in fact, to be leaning into it so that we can listen for that answer to what we need to be doing with it. Because if we push it away because we don't like it, the further we run from it, or the further we push it away, or ignore it, or demonize it, or pretend it's not there, or judge it, the more we distance this piece of ourselves from ourselves, the less we're able to work with it, because we're not in relationship with it anymore. So counterintuitively, we actually need to befriend grief as we befriend all our feelings through the mindful lens. And just staying in the question. You may not have the answers this evening immediately, but these are worthy questions. So this practice is just a mindfully leaning into grief as a starting point, as what is grief looking like and how's it showing up? And what's it asking me to do? Just coming back to the breath. Excuse me. As we're coming back, if your eyes are being closed, you can open them. And noticing perhaps that it's possible to live in these two worlds at the same time. To harmonize the interior world and that interior experience of grief, your relationship with it, and the thinking world, which is often outwardly focused, as we move on to the talk. The rest of the presentation is primarily an expansion of what we've just experienced. It's elaborating on the practice we've just had. And so the purpose of the slides is really just to give you some additional thoughts and reflections and things to carry forward. And not every slide will speak to you strongly or weakly. And you'll be able to take away what you need to from this evening. And if there's only one or two slides that really speak to you, then it's been worthwhile showing up, because that slide, whatever I have to offer, is the one that resonates with your authentic self, your soul, what's called for this evening, and how you can enter into that relationship with grief. This is a slide from Tara Brach, a well-known teacher. And this is just a summary of what we did. We just recognized grief because it's here. There was an invitation to just accept it without demonizing it or running away. And acceptance doesn't mean you have to like it. Far from it. Acceptance is just acknowledging it, that it's here. And if I push it away, I can't work with it. We need to investigate what it is, what its nature, my relationship, and then see what comes up. And sometimes it takes a while to listen because we haven't always practiced being with the deepest part of ourselves. And so to just be curious and open and let it rain. And there's another N that some people have added to the acronym, and that is to nurture. That we can actively nurture if nothing seems to be coming out. We can nurture and ask ourselves, what would be a mindful, wise, intentional state of mind, or what can help to nurture the friendly relationship I need to have with all parts of myself. Carl Jung, the psychologist, said, as far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle the light in the darkness of mere being. And Carl Jung's onto something here. Because really we need to recognize, as the Yin Yang symbol on the lower right points out, that wholeness, and we are everything. Wholeness consists of light and dark. The light and the dark do not dominate each other. There's light in the dark, there's dark in the light. And there's a gentle relationship between those two parts, and together they make up the whole. There's no way that you can have light without dark. There's no way that you can actually know grief without joy, and vice versa. So to recognize that the word can mean only or nothing, a smidgen. It's merely this. But mere also has another meaning because it comes from the word, the same root as the word sea, mer in French. MER. So that represents an oceanic something. So Carl Jung is onto something here, that because of the darkness, because of grief, we need to light candles. Let's look at our perspective. Where are we right now? And in Chinese, the symbol for crisis represents danger and opportunity. And as mentioned, we can tend to run away from danger, just as we can tend to run away from grief. And we can think of COVID as being a disaster. And we had this impact 2 years ago. It was a honeymoon phase. And then this horrible impact and disillusionment, and we sink into the darkness and triggering events and anniversaries. And then there's a working through this grief and there's setbacks along the way. And then we're in this phase of reconstruction, which is always now. Because wherever we are, no matter how far back we look or into the future, we're relating to that past or that future from this perspective now. Right? And everybody's heard the term, the power of now. The power of now, because this is the moment we're fully in control. We can't control what's happened, but we are, in a way, able to meet with mindfulness and gentility and befriending whatever's coming up, and no matter how horrible it is. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse have shown up in the last couple of years: death, famine, conquest, and war. And this can take up a prominent place and really bring that whole yin-yang piece way out of whack, where we can't see much light. What's interesting, though, is if we look in the light in the background here, we actually see angels. And in the background, we see a book which represents wisdom, and we see a gentle lamb, right? And we see a rainbow. And I read something recently which said that tears are the water through which the light will shine in our inner rainbow. To make it personal, on the 11th of February 2013, my sister Louise died suddenly of a heart attack. And she lives over in Zimbabwe. And I had to fly back 4 flights, 4 separate countries. And she was buried on Valentine's Day of 2013. And it was a Monday morning when she died, and I was on a call live with two of her children in South Africa just while she actually died, and they just got the call from the hospital. And what's interesting is that Sunday night, I just returned from a treat with John Tarrant, the author of the book on the right. And I bought his book. It was called The Light Inside the Dark. And I had 28, 29 hours to get back for Louisa's funeral. And it was on the plane that I read most of his book. And somehow I couldn't have timed the arrival of the book more perfectly to be able to do this. And we had a close relationship. So what is grief? Well, grief is the pain of personal loss. There is unsanctioned and sanctioned grief. Sanctioned grief are the obvious losses, but unsanctioned grief is part of what has been increasingly recognized in the last few years in the literature and research. It is those things we might have looked forward to, but they're never going to happen. And there's been plenty of that for so many people through COVID. So there have been people who were hoping for a raise, people were hoping for a better job, people were hoping for a decent experience at university, people were hoping for all kinds of things. And we can grieve for things we wanted but never got. And it's an important piece of grief because it's no less important or valuable. Grief involves shock and a disorientation. There's often a sense of injustice. Something is wrong with this picture because it's not the way my story planned. It causes a dissonance in our thinking mind. The word suffering is interesting because it has the same root as the word suffuse, so to sort of steep through. And suffering is related to the word endurance. So grief is something, and suffering is something we have to endure because the only way out of it is through it. There's no shortcuts. Grief has a gravity to it. It's very, very deep. And when these come together all of a sudden, certainly it can feel disastrous. And disastrous in the sense that not only is it very personal, but it can feel pervasive and permanent. That I'm never, ever, ever going to get out of this. A sense that there are no candles anywhere. This is it. It's over. So grief can have these components to it. And of course, there are many more aspects to it. But these are just some of the universal ones that many of us can relate to. The Yin Yang symbol has been increasingly valuable for me in the last many years because the power of it suggests that it speaks to that relationship I'm talking about with the darkness and the light. That we often struggle. We have these two red arrows inside ourselves battling. This shouldn't happen. This is bad. Why did this happen? Injustice. This is horrible. I don't like it. I call it the yucky stuff. And we want to push the yucky stuff away, but we can't because it's here. There's no way to get rid of this stuff. So we struggle, we battle. And we're battling with ourselves. And when we battle with ourselves, nobody wins. You can't win a war with yourself. So there's an invitation to shift into this making peace with these two separate parts of ourselves. We need to make peace with, yes, the yucky stuff. Because when we demonize it and push it away, we're trying to exclude parts of ourselves and we become fractured. We become disconnected from ourselves. And in that disconnection, we lose sight of the wholeness and the fullness. We lose sight of the picture. There's a book, Necessary Losses. And the author of that book is the same woman who wrote Alexander and the No Good, Horrible, Terrible Day, that kid's book. And in fact, when I first saw this book, a couple of decades ago, I was shocked by the title because my vision back then was losses. How can a loss be necessary? How can something so horrible be necessary? And as I grew in my own life, I recognized that the snake has to shed its skin in order to grow. And in fact, the snake, as both a symbol of poison and death, is also in many traditions the symbol of life. And we see the snake around the caduceus and around the medical symbol staff, and the snake around Hermes, who is the trickster god who brings messages. And in fact, the losses, the butterfly has to give up itself as a caterpillar in order to be reborn into something new. So we have to give up, or we can fight it. Not we have to, you can choose to fight it, but it generally doesn't work. And the struggle, of course, of the butterfly is you should not cut the cocoon open and let the butterfly fly too early, because the butterfly actually strengthens its wings as it's breaking free from the cocoon. The struggle strengthens the butterfly. A mindful process, again, sort of summarizing here. We need to pay attention, which is what I've tried to do this evening, as always. When we pay attention, we become aware. We become aware of our avoidance or demonization of grief. We recognize that distance might not be helpful, so we have a choice and we set intention. My intention is to befriend all parts of myself so that I don't need to be at war anymore. And the moment I do that, I'm in a wiser mind and I'm likely to take a wiser action and get a better outcome. And as you can see, there's a big picture here about better outcome. I'm not talking about happier. I'm not talking about pleasing or nice. It's much bigger than that. Better. And so it starts with paying attention and recognizing we have choices about how we respond to stuff we don't like. The orchestra, we all have an orchestra. We tend to believe that the bottom three, just thinking and emotions, I can think my way through all this stuff. The thinking part, the front part of the brain here in pink. And my emotions, I just have to think my way through my emotions. I have to regulate myself and calm down. These three are important, but these aren't the only instruments in the orchestra of our humanity. There are more instruments in three, and I call these four the golden instruments. The first one is the ethical. What's good for me and therefore good for other people? So goodness, we need to look for goodness. We need to look for those candles. In the relationship to ourselves, this is why I put relationships in here. Not only relationship with others, but my relationship with myself. What is my relationship to the grief? What kind of heart, spirit, and energy do I want to have because of the grief, in spite of the grief, to help me through the grief? What kind of heart and spirit and energy? Because if we just sit in the darkness, it's going to stay dark for a long time. I use the word soul here in two ways. Some of you have heard me talk about this in the past. The soul, as Carl Jung talks about it, is the genuine, authentic self. That's the deepest part of what makes you, you, your uniqueness, your special. And special not in an arrogant sense, but your unique makeup. If you are a monotheist and you believe you were given a soul by God, then that works just as well, because many people say, what is my work on this earth? What does God want me to do? Right? We've all seen the bumper sticker. What would Jesus do? What would Buddha do? Whichever way it works, because it's that kind of guiding light, that real part of our humanity. And we need to bring these in, because this is where the healing takes place. Thinking can help us figure out what we need to do, But this is how we need to be doing it, all this stuff here. This is where we need to start investigating. This is where we need to bring in that natural arising and the nurturing. So we're back to the question, what is grief asking of me? So we drop in as a drop of water, and then we see what drops out the other side. What distills out as we meet the grief. Etty Hillesum was a Dutch woman. She's less famous than Anne Frank, but she was at the age of 29 killed in Auschwitz concentration camp. And she wrote a lot about her relationship with God, and she thought a lot about humanity. And her work was published, part of it was actually published during her lifetime. And she said, ultimately, we have just one moral duty: to reclaim larger areas of peace ourselves, more and more peace, and reflect it outwards. The more peace there is in us, the more peace there will be in our troubled world. And that's the bit we can affect, that harmonic relationship between us and the grief. And we could be applying this whole talk to any difficult emotion. It could be frustration. It could be anger. It could be anxiety. It could be depression. It just so happens that we decided on the topic of grief for tonight. But everything I'm saying is a way to approach any part of us that we're struggling with. Letting go is not giving in. Letting go is giving up the struggle, the fighting, the stuff that doesn't work anymore. It's an opening up for something new. We may not know what it is yet, because as we light the candles and in the darkness, we're going to spend some time orienting to figure out where we need to go. But giving up the darkness is the first step. In Japan, they have a tradition of little statues. And these statues are about 2-3 feet high. And they're often put up when babies die. And there are temples all over Japan. And when we were in Japan, my wife and I, some years ago, we were at a temple. And there were hundreds of these. And we saw this little character, Jizo, J-I-Z-O. And that's what I looked like as a kid. And I just had to take a photograph of it, of course. And so we need to give up as part of those necessary losses. We need to let go of parts of our childhood. That's also part of a grief. And let go, to give up to something new. And as the mythologist Joseph Campbell said, we have to let go of the life we planned so as to accept the one that's waiting for us. And of course, grief always interrupts the life we planned, because we have to accept the one that's waiting for us. What ingredients can we begin to bring to settling into that place where there's a greater harmonic? Well, the word core, care, and cardiac all have the same root: the heart. We're back to that golden instrument. What's our heart and spirit and energy? We need to orient ourselves towards healing and health and wholeness. Those three words have the same root. And if we look at this, this is way beyond thinking. This is way beyond words. This is way inside where the wound is, where the grief is. What do I want and how do I get there? Sort of another summary slide I've used in the past. So about 6 months into COVID, late 2020, I was struggling in my ways with COVID and all kinds of feelings. And I found myself speeded up, as we always do. We want to get things over with. We become impatient. And so I thought, what do I need to do Well, I need to slow down, be patient and kind, SPK. And when we slow down, we're automatically practicing patience. We're automatically leaning into what is here now. And we're obviously being kinder to ourselves because we're not trying to rush away from those parts we'd rather dispossess. So whenever I'm feeling speeded or pressured, I do my SPK. That's how I get to where I'm going to be going. And what is it that I look for? Well, there's so many different things we can look for, but I came up for me, my guiding lights. If I had 3 candles to move towards or move with, it would be peace, beauty, and joy. You got it, the peanut butter and jam. Peace, beauty, and joy are my guides. Of course, I asked myself the question, well, why do I want those 3, Allan? And I said to myself, whenever I am at war with myself or others, or with my grief and fighting, it's not helpful. So I look for peace. When do I need to look for beauty? Whenever I start to feel ugly inside, and we all know what our own ugliness feels like. Perhaps it's criticism, perhaps it's harshness, perhaps it's demonization of the self, perhaps it's an unkind word, and we go, oh, that was ugly. I didn't like that. I look for beauty. When do I need to look for joy? When the D words show up. Depressed, despondent, dire, despairing. And it's really important that I'm not saying that, oh, this is all I need to do and it's going to happen in the next 5 minutes, because that's completely unreal. Because the slowness and the patience that's required on the right-hand side, that grief is a process, and we need to make the circumstances in which it will heal. That's our job. And so there are no timelines, there's no dates. You can't say, well, I'd like my grief to be over. Well, I've been grieving a week. No, it doesn't work like that. So whenever you find that kind of thinking mind believing that somehow the thinking mind's going to get you through this, it won't. In the stillness of the quiet, if we listen, we can hear the whisper of the heart. And as we did in the practice at the beginning, in the stillness of the quiet, if we listen, we can hear the whispers of the heart. We can look for the golden instruments, the goodness, the relationship with self. We can look for certain heart, spirit, and energy if it's not there. And we can ask ourselves, what's the most important thing that's called for? Howard Thurman was a preacher in the United States, and he was a friend of Martin Luther King Sr. and a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. So from the darkness and the emptiness and the grief and the disorientation, we need to create ourselves. And we need to create ourselves right here where we are now. And this is on the roof of the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo. I chose these pictures for a couple of reasons. On the left is Adam, and he's sitting on earth. He's grounded. And there's the representation of God and the angels. And there's an air and a movement and a spirit. And it was only a couple of years ago that I suddenly saw, I read, that in fact that red shell, and the shell is a birthplace, that shell is in the shape of a human brain, and the front of the brain would be here, and the back of the brain way down here. Of course, Michelangelo knew anatomy very well. And what's interesting also is, although of course this was quite patriarchal, but in a smaller fresco on the roof, this is God birthing Eve from Adam's rib. And of course, it's from his left-hand side because that's where his heart is. And Adam is asleep, and Adam is in darkness. And there's this tree limb and this movement upwards. And so from nothing, from emptiness, from the space, there is this potentiality to create something anew, to let go of the losses, so in the service of creation. Through Joseph Campbell and mythology, and there's of course, and by the way, there's a similar story to this, and this is a Greek. There's a similar story to this in ancient Sumeria. There's a similar story in Japan, because the mythologies are universal stories. Let's start with the god Apollo, who is related to these golden practices, these higher ways of being in ourselves. And he's often shown with a golden harp. And he is a warrior. And Apollo he married Calliope. And Calliope is the greatest of the muses. And the muses are those manifestations of universal spirits that flow and are part of our creativity, related to poetry and dance and music and literature. So Calliope is often shown holding a wind instrument, and there, of course, is poetry. Now, Calliope and Apollo had, according to some legends, their son was Orpheus. And Orpheus was a great poet and the greatest musician of his time. And he also learned the lyre from his father, and the harp. And Orpheus was married to Eurydice. And Eurydice was a nymph, and she was beautiful, and she was enticed by Orpheus's beautiful music. And on the day of her wedding, she was bitten by the snake. And she died, and she went down to the underworld, to death. And Orpheus's music was playing. He was grieving so loudly and singing so strongly, and the music, and he was asking everybody, what should I do? And they said to him, you need to go to the underworld. You need to go join Eurydice. So at that time, Hades, the guardian of the underworld, would not let people go back to the upper world. Once you got there, that was it. There was no going back. But what's interesting is Hermes, as the trickster god, Hermes was the only god that Hades allowed to move between heaven and earth, between heaven and hell, between grief and joy. No other god was allowed to leave the underworld once he'd gone there. But Hermes, as part of his work as a trickster and a messenger, was allowed to go. So Hermes met Eurydice and Orpheus, and there they are holding hands. I met them in the underworld. And Orpheus played his music so beautifully and his poetry that Hades actually had sympathy, and Hades' heart was softened. And he said, you can take Eurydice back to the upper world, to the world of the living, from this place of death, but only on one condition. You have to lead the way, Orpheus. And when you get to the upper world, you cannot look back. You cannot look back to see where Eurydice is. And of course, his love for Eurydice, he and Eurydice started their voyage back to the upper world, the world of light. And Orpheus, because he was ahead, got there first. And you can guess what happened is he looked back, but Eurydice wasn't into the upper world yet. And as he looked back, he lost her again, and he lost her forever. The first time I heard this poem, I was at a retreat and I cried. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. You must feel the future dissolve in a moment like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go, so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow and you must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it's only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, it is I. Unfortunately, I had a bar at the bottom of my poem. It is only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, it is I you have been looking for, and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend. So in the frigid coldness of January 2021 in Fish Creek Park, it was -18. It was early one Sunday morning, and walking in the frigid weather, which I'm sometimes disinclined to do with my dog, there was this moment where this happened. And I don't even know what she was looking at, but it just said it all, because this captures both the frigidity and the rising sun and the cold on her fur and the frost. So in the midst of the frigidity and the coldness and the emptiness of grief, we need to look for the rays and the sun and the sunshine and the warmth. Grief invites us to, and this is my last slide, actually a couple more. These are the vistas. Grief invites us into a vista. And close up, it can be very windy and blurred. And we always need to, yes, be aware and meet what's immediately in front of us. But we also need to expand our horizons and look into the distance, even though it becomes indistinct and somewhat foggy. And we need to journey because we have no choice. I mentioned the book on the right already, The Light Inside the Dark, John Tarrant. And he writes beautifully. He's a beautiful Australian Zen teacher. He lives in LA now. I'm sorry, north of San Francisco. And this is a wonderful book. It's sort of a read a day. Grieving is loving. Compassionate words for bearing what seems initially to be the unbearable. This is a link that's available through, it's a Calgary Alliance. It's available on the AHS website. Calgary Development Learning Initiative. It's a grief toolkit. And it's got some very wonderful pictures. It's useful for yourself. It's useful for family members, for kids. It's in a beautiful form. It was very well researched. I highly recommend it. And it's on the website, CDLI, Calgary Development Learning Initiative. I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Your mic, Christine, please. Sorry.
Thank you. Allan, as always, thank you for the wisdom that you bring, and of course your poetic nature and how you weave story together to bring home your wisdom is always appreciated by me. And I'm grateful for all that you've shared tonight. So thank you.
Thank you.
I want to open it up to participants now to share any questions that you might have. And just a reminder that while Dr. Donsky does have experience in mental health, that our Q&A really is not a forum intended to deal with personal issues, but really that tonight's presentation was meant for educational purposes, and that any of the questions that you may have, if you could bring it as it relates to Dr. Donsky's presentation. So I will turn it over to the group now to see, and I think Bar.
We've got a couple of wonderful questions, yeah.
Yeah, do you see some of them in there? Specifically one here first from Bar. Can you talk more about unsanctioned grief, please? I like having a name for what won't be and the idea that it's worth acknowledging and grieving.
There's a wonderful elaboration on the question of unsanctioned grief, and what's coming up for me, I haven't had this bubbling up here before. And that's the value of allowing a few moments for something to bubble up. Because we live in the present moment, we also are aware that we can go backwards in time. We can go back, we have memories, we remember things, and then we lose things along the way, including our childhood or innocence or whatever. And then we lose things that we're attached to. In the same way that we can project ourselves backwards, I think we also capable of projecting ourselves forward into the future, towards things we look forward to. So a lot of the grief literature recognizes that there are things that won't be, and that we can grieve for them, because in a way we've lived in them, we've imagined them to be, we've wanted them to come true, we've invested energy in them, and then even though they were in some sense a phantasm, they were something of the imagination, we are emotionally attached to them in the future. So when they go poof and it doesn't happen, we feel the same feelings of loss as if something we had back there. So I think that, yes, and it's worth acknowledging and grieving. It's worth acknowledging and grieving because we all have the unsanctioned griefs which go on and on. My mother died 5 months before I graduated medical school and got married. 5 months. And so there was this grief of not having her around and never meeting any of her grandchildren. And so to work with that and to work with it wisely and recognize it. And this year is 40 years since my mom died. So that is, yeah, I've had lots of unsanctioned griefs along the way. When my kids were born, when my daughter got married, etc.
Mm-hmm. When you were presenting, Allan, you talked about us finding ways to befriend our grief. And when I hear you talk about that it feels like, significant grief or a loss really is a part of us. And you talked about that it's not really like a linear healing. And so, when you share that this is a loss, that grief is something that actually becomes a part of us. And I heard you say that, like when we look at the Yin and Yang symbol, it's like the shadow and the light, and it's within us now. And so maybe you could just share a little bit more around what it means for us to actually befriend that, to actually find that acceptance.
Language is always interesting, and this isn't a criticism in any way, because I talk like this as well sometimes. You said grief becomes part of us. I'd like to suggest that grief is already a part of us. It's not something outside of us, and then it becomes, it's not like it invades me. It's already here. That's the truth of some of the work with meditation and mindfulness is you're right with your whole experience right now. So it's not that it becomes part of us, because then we can say, oh, well, that implies it wasn't part of me before, so I just need to figure out a way to put it back out there again. And no, it's right here. So if it's already here, the second part of that is that we can either be harsh with it, or we can be friendly. Because we get to choose what relationship we have with it. We get to choose whether or not we want to fight or flight from it, or freeze, right? Which is the natural instinct, the yucky stuff. I don't want this. This is horrible. This hurts. It's the worst kind of hurt. I don't want it. So we can demonize it, ignore it, argue with it, try and rationalize it away, bottle it up, drug it, all kinds of addictions, avoidance, distractions, none of which is helpful for us or our relationship with the grief, because all of those things make it worse. So I can either be struggling with it, or I can befriend it. Now, that is counterintuitive, because my instinct says, I don't want this. I want to get it over with. This is horrible. Well, good luck. Because that's like saying, well, I've got road rash and I look at my knee and I've got all these bits of gravel and there's sand in there. And it's like, I don't want to touch this. It's sore. So yeah, it's going to be a difficult process. But if you don't tend to that knee, it's going to get infected. It's not going to heal.
Right.
So to touch it gently and to become friendly with the knee and go, I know pain. This is going to be sore, Mr. Knee. It's going to hurt as I pluck the gravel out. But I promise I'm going to do it as kindly and gently as I can, because I want you to get better. I want to heal with you and for you. And let's go on this journey together. So we talk about befriending all the feelings in mindfulness, all of it, so that we don't push it away.
One of the participants shared a quote from you, which is, grief invites us. This is beautiful freedom from imprisonment of loss to reveal a pathway to gain for me. Thank you, Allan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful acknowledgement.
Thank you.
Luke B, I appreciated in the rain slide, recognize, accept, etc., that you said that accepting something doesn't mean you have to like it. So just what you've been acknowledging now, and that will stick with me.
Yeah. Let me say a little more, because I can always say more on any slide. I'm glad that landed, and this is an opportunity. We got the time. This is an opportunity to expand on what acceptance is. Mm-hmm. Let me start by saying what acceptance is not, because there's a whole lot of misunderstandings. Acceptance does not mean you like it. Acceptance does not mean you got to suck it up. Acceptance does not mean you have to force yourself into enjoying it. Acceptance does not mean you lie there and do nothing and be passive about it. Acceptance does not mean you wallow in it. It's none of that. So let's just park all that. Acceptance is nothing other than not resisting. We had a speaker on a few weeks ago, a colleague of ours, Anne Mahoney, and I learned that from her, because Anne's a great teacher. I was at a retreat with her, and she said resistance is nothing other than, acceptance is just not resisting. That's all it is. And the wisdom of that is, if I don't resist it, I can lean into it, and we've got to be gentle and kind and tolerate it. And if we get overwhelmed, we pull back like the burning coal. But don't resist it, because the only way out of it is through it. So that's what acceptance is. And once we get rid of the stuff that doesn't make sense, what does make sense automatically fills the space. Yeah. There was a question that we skipped over there. Sorry, Christine, higher up, a little higher up.
About unsanctioned grief?
No, there's one interested in the concept of ambiguous loss.
Oh, yes.
So what's ambiguous? Yeah. Oh, sorry, did you?
No, please.
Yeah. Ambiguous loss. There are a couple of examples, and I'm sure there are many more. So the word ambiguous means that there's more than one feeling going on at a time. The kind of grief I've honed in on tonight is the one where there was really something that was valuable and it's gone. Ambiguous loss, and sometimes the term ambivalent loss can come in. So you may have a relationship with someone that you're close with in your family, and the relationship has not been smooth or harmonious. There might have been acrimony or even anger. At worst, the person might have been nasty to you. In worst cases, traumatized you. So when that person is close enough in your family and there's an automatic attachment, if something bad happens to that person or they die, you can have mixed feelings. You can be at the same time grateful you don't need to deal with them anymore. But you can also start to feel guilty about it. You can start to mourn what you might have wanted that person to be in your life, but they couldn't be that way. The reason forgiveness is such an important practice, and forgiveness is to open up. I hinted at it about that giving into something. Forgiveness is about letting go of wishing you had a different past. I'll say that again. Forgiveness is letting go of wishing you had a different past. Forgiveness is not about sucking up your feelings, letting the person off the hook, pretending it didn't happen, denying your experience. That's not forgiveness. There's a whole lot of knots in there. So that's one example of ambiguous grief. There can be ambiguous grief, for example, if you have an elderly relative who's dying and they're suffering enormously. You can be having anticipatory grief that they're going to die, but you also know that there's going to be a sense of relief, that they're going to be out of their pain and their misery. They're ready to go. That's another kind of ambiguity or ambivalent. And I'm not sure I've answered the question, but those are two common things where grief can be complicated because of the relationship you had. The grief I was talking about tonight is just about the easiest kind of relationship where it's so obvious and it wasn't complicated by this other stuff. You can also grieve for things that you might have wanted. You might have had a family member in your family who you wanted to be a certain way with you, but they weren't. So you can grieve for what that person wasn't able to be in your life. It's another kind of grieving.
One question that has come in is about, what about clinging to grief as a way to stay close to our lost loved one?
Great. Yes. So I won't say much about when we're clinging, we're stuck. We can't move. And there are a couple of reasons, and I'm sure there are others than the ones I'm going to mention. There are a couple of reasons why we want to cling to the grief. We believe that if we light candles and we move on, you can feel guilty. I shouldn't be having light when things are so dark, right? It's happened so often that we know people, and within a day or two of somebody dying, and you're in a house of mourning, right? And they're laughing and they're going, oh my goodness, I shouldn't be laughing here. He or she only died 2 days ago. We feel guilty about that letting go because we believe that somehow we're going to lose that. We're not honoring the memory. We're not honoring the relationship we had to that person. So for this person, and again, I'm not going to get any personal on the details here, but for this person to ask themselves, what is it that's keeping you clinging? What's your fear about letting go? What's the fear about letting go? What's keeping you clinging? What will you lose if you open yourself up to lighting the candles, restoring the harmony, finding your PBJ again? And it often comes from a little sense of guilt. I'm not allowed to. This is how I should be grieving. This is how I should be mourning. And we need no better example than the Irish wake, where after the funeral, everybody goes and they have a celebration of life. And if we just pause for one moment, the reason for the celebration of life is exactly that, the celebration of life. So we celebrate the person's life. We celebrate our lives because we have to let go in order to come back to life. That's the restoration, that's the harmony, that's the integration, that's the befriending.
There was another comment around the befriending. Allan was like, can you talk about how one can embody our grief as a way to befriend it?
You set the intention. When you find yourself wrestling, denying, pushing it away, wanting to overcome it quickly, getting impatient, all those are ways of not being friendly with the grief. So the moment you notice you're at war and you are wrestling with it and you want to speed it up, that's not friendly. This is also very counterintuitive. We don't want to, what do you mean I need to befriend my grief? It's horrible. I don't want to be friends with a horrible person. No, but your grief is inviting you into something. The grief is inviting you into that. And John Tarrant's book, wow. I mean, the timing of that was incredible. And by the time I got back for Louisa's funeral, it's just beautiful because he gently takes you on this journey inwards. And then you just start to see the little cracks, right? Leonard Cohen, the cracks are where the light comes in. You start to see the little cracks as you crack your heart open to yourself. You start to open up, and you can't speed up that process. What befriending and leaning in does is it creates the circumstances for that opening up. Remember that we have to be with the wound in order to tend to it. The word attention and the word tender, right? And a physician in a hospital is called the attending. They all have the same root. There's a gentility, there's a kindness, there's a softness, there's a compassion. And compassion means to be with suffering. You need to be with it, not wallow in it, not cling to it, but just stay with it and ask what's called for. What is needed right now? What is it asking me? And maybe it's letting go. Maybe it's more tears. Maybe it's I don't know. Maybe it's I need to be quiet and listen. Maybe it's I need to slow down. Maybe it's I need to talk to a friend, right? Or a spiritual advisor, or write some poetry, or go for a walk, right? Or listen to some music, whatever. Just listen in that moment and you'll know what you need to do.
Allan, could you share the definition of forgiveness again, please?
Forgiveness is the capacity to let go of wishing you had had a different past. Forgiveness is the capacity to let go of wishing you'd had a different past. Because there are two parts to forgiving. The one is forgiving ourselves, which is often hard because we're very critical of ourselves. I should do this, I should have done that, shoulda, coulda, woulda. Very hard on ourselves. We need to forgive ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Forgiving other people doesn't mean you actually need to talk to them or write to them or phone them or text them or anything. But when we don't forgive, we're grasping, we're holding on to the past. And all that happens is we tend to ruminate and try undo that story. And what happens is it just keeps us in the past. We're at war with ourselves because life wants to move forward, but this is hanging on. That's why they say if you want to seek revenge, and you better dig 2 graves. Yeah. So forgiving, and I love language, it's a compound word, for and giving. Forgiving. Well, forgiving what? Well, it becomes interesting. So when we're clinging, we open up so we can give it away, what's holding us back. And now our hands are open, we can also receive what we need to receive from ourselves and others. So it opens a different kind of space. Whenever we're angry, we're shutting down. Whenever we're anxious, we're closing down. Whenever we're grasping, we're closing down. And then there's no opportunity, there's no growth, there's no movement, there's no flow, there's no light. And there are times in the past when I've said to angry people and teenagers, do you want to feel justified? And it's often around something like anger. I could also ask grief. Do you want to feel justified or do you want to feel better? Well, here's why I'm feeling X, Y, Z. And I get the whole story again. I've heard it 20 times and you're just spinning. All of us have done it. I've done it myself. It doesn't help me feel better. And sometimes we've got that choice, that moment of choice. Do I want to feel justified or do I want to feel better? Because sometimes the two are not compatible. They're just not going to go together. The mind wants to be justified. But the 4 golden instruments have got another way to navigate. Anxiety, stress, depression, grief, you name it.
Such a good reminders, Allan, around the PBJ and all of those choices that, you know, the wise choice for our own journey to have a sense of ownership and self-authorship about our relationship with grief. Like, I love the reminders that you've given us for that.
Yeah. The word authorship, thank you. I love playing with words. The word authorship, of course, is about writing a narrative. It's also where the word authority comes from. Our own internal authority that we have within us deeply. Whatever's happened to us, we can rewrite the story. That's the beauty. That's the beauty of life. Carl Jung also said, you are not what happened to you. You are who you choose to become. Now, between those 2 phrases, there's a lot of work. I'm not denying for 1 second that this is flicking a light switch, but there's a truth. We are not, you are not what happened to you. You are who you choose to become. And when you see that, that opens up, there's a whole space there, which is what growth and individuation and possibility. And into that space, we bring friendliness, whatever the qualities are of friendliness, kindness, compassion, joy, look for the beauty, look for the light, reach out, connect, slow down, be creative, be curious if you don't know, because it's always there. It's always there.
And I love that reminder that it can be small moments. You know, we can look for those sustained, like bigger experiences that take us from the grief. And yet, even just like you said, a walk outside, you know, whatever it is that we're asking for, like petting my dog, you know, just those small moments that will bring us the PBJ, the PBJ.
Small moments.
Yeah. I think that's probably all of the questions.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, there's lots of
I
comments.
like, yeah.
Please go ahead.
Lots of food for thought. There's nourishment. Yes, I love the metaphor there from one participant. Food for thoughts.
That's right. Allan.
Oh, there was another comment. I can respond to another comment.
Oh, please.
Thanks for sharing the subject with us. It helps with the isolation that can come with grief. I'd like to suggest that there are two isolations here. There's an invitation to, when we befriend something, we're more open. We're more open to that part of ourselves. And so we're actually less isolated from ourselves. So yes, it helps with the isolation that can come with grief. Because with grief, if we're pushing it away, we don't only feel the rupture of what we've lost, we also feel ruptured and fractured inside. Mm-hmm. So that comment touches on something there. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Grateful came up. Yes, we can experience gratitude for being able to recognize that we can see the light. Yeah. All these comments are just reframes in participants' language. Yeah. I think I've covered most of it. Yes, thank you.
Allan,
there's one more.
Allan, yeah. Can I give you an invite to, you've given us so much tonight, but it would be really helpful, I think, just for some final closing thoughts from you before we sign off. So if you'd like to share that with us.
The KISS acronym popped in my head. Keep it simple, sweetie. So here's, I'm going to be sweet with myself. Mm-hmm. I come back to the Yin Yang symbol because just contemplating on that helps me remind that the dark is part of the light. Together, the two pieces make the wholeness, the healing. That if one part is too dominant, mindfully, we can pay attention and make a choice to look at the relationship with it. We can be kind with ourselves. We befriend, we're back to the title of the talk. Befriend it again and again and again. Remembering the importance of loss. The skin shedding its, or the snake shedding its skin. We're able to come back from hell to find the light again, to retrieve our loved one. Not to cling. So whatever has touched you tonight, whatever one or two things that you've heard or felt or said, that's all you've got to take away from tonight. Whatever has touched you in whatever way, a phrase, a slide, an image, a story, a metaphor, a piece of word, sit with that. And then as you reflect on it, as you drop in to your grief, you will bring that piece in, because that will be your guide, that will be your Hermes, your messenger. I want to thank everyone for their beautiful participation tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Allan, as always, as always.
Thank you, Christine.
Yes, so grateful to share tonight with you, Allan. You always leave me with much to consider, and my heart feels open and soft, and thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
I just want to remind folks that are still on that, again, you can visit our website to register for any of our upcoming events with our speakers. And a reminder that a couple of people have asked, Allan's presentation tonight will be on our website next week if you would like to revisit it or see any of the slides. And as you come to our website, just a reminder that we all do this on a volunteer basis. And in order to keep WTM thriving, we do rely on your generous donations. So while you're there, if you feel like donating to support us so that we can keep doing this work, we'd be grateful. So thank you again for all of you for being here tonight, and we will see you on the third Thursday of May. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Maya, for the wonderful hosting and the public library. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye, Allan.